The leaning back's a little odd.
It's kind of. So, welcome to the podcast, Aaron.
Yeah, thank you.
So you're the web standards guy.
One of them. One of the many. Yeah.
Yeah. So. Yeah. Do you like to be called the web standards guy, or is it sort of something?
I don't know. I mean, I've been doing it for I've been doing the web standards thing for a long time. I don't know. I'm fine being somebody who stands up for web standards. I'm certainly not the only one. But I enjoy it. I mean, I think I've kind of my career has certainly gone through phases where I was more known for JavaScript at one point, and then I kind of found my niche in the progressive enhancement space, and so I obviously that's where I focus the lion's share of my work. But at the same time, I also love accessibility stuff, and I still love doing JavaScript work, and mainly I just want to make the web better and make the web work for everyone that it can possibly work for.
Yeah. So how did you end up on that path? I mean, who falls into web standards, and how does it happen?
Right. So I actually started out in. I started out in journalism way back. I was running a magazine, and I came to the web by trying to bring that magazine online around about 1996.
Yeah.
Framesets and all that fun stuff. And then I want to say it was probably in 2000. Well, I started my web career in earnest in like 1999, where I was actually getting paid by somebody else to do web stuff. And I was working for a newspaper at that time, and I literally I'd go in at 11 o'clock at night, and I'd prep the paper for release like sometime between usually midnight and 5 a.m.
Yeah.
So at that point, the stories had gone into the terminal system and were being laid out in Quark for press. And so I would take those Quark files for the different newspaper sections as they were done, and I would choose which stories I felt needed to go online. So I would take those and I would drop them into Dreamweaver templates, do all of the additional markup that I needed to do, and then use Fetch to push them up to the site. It was very lo-fi. I was the content management system. I was also the editorial decision maker for what was going online.
You don't have any old business card that says content manager?
No, it would have been really funny if I did. But yeah, I used to work from like 11 until like 6 or 7 in the morning, which was just kind of awful.
Yeah.
But then, when I left, that was when I was living in Florida. I was working for the Bradenton Herald. I moved to Connecticut and started consulting for a lot of larger companies like Gartner and Deloitte & Touche and folks like that. And I think it was around about 2000, I stumbled on Eric Meyer's work and some of the stuff he was doing with CSS. And I had dabbled with CSS here and there. I think it was mainly for link hovers and stuff to do it without JavaScript. And that was right around the same time that things were starting to stabilize a little bit on the web. The work of the Web Standards Project that had been done to date had worked to get us towards a standard DOM that all of the DOM level 0 that all the browsers were implementing. And so the kind of crazy spaghetti code that we used to have to write to make JavaScript work in Netscape and Internet Explorer and Opera, if we were considering that, because they all kind of had their own thing going on. It was really painful, and so I started to see the work that Eric Meyer was doing, and then through that ended up looking at a list apart and looking at what was going on with the Web Standards Project, and I saw that as being the only way to build a firm foundation for the web of the future, because without a solid foundation, any building is not going to be structurally sound, right? So these foundational web standards were going to make it possible for us to build the interfaces of the future and not have to write as much awful code and not have to maintain that stuff over time. And so that's when I got the web standards bug. I set this seed in my mind that one day I was going to meet Jeffrey Zeldman and I was going to meet Eric Meyer and I was going to be involved in a list apart in the Web Standards Project, and those were kind of dreams at that point around 2000, 2001. I gave my first conference talk in 2003 on XHTML at COMDEX. And,
those were the days.
Yeah. And that was where I met Molly Holzschlag. And so Molly saw me talk, and she thought I did a really good job. I was, of course, insanely nervous and stumbling over all my words, but she was nice and told me that I did well. And Eric was supposed to be there too, and she and Eric were going to co-present a talk on CSS, but I want to say that may have been around the time that they adopted Carolyn, their first daughter, and so he was unable to make it, and so she asked me if I wanted to sit in Eric's spot, like on her talk, and like
no
chime in, and I was like, "Are you kidding me? Like, is this some sort of a joke?" But anyway, so I said I would, I'd be happy to. I don't know how much I can add, but I'm happy to be up there, and so she wonderfully invited me onto her talk and asked me like to weigh in on the stuff that she was discussing, which she was completely capable of talking about all on her own.
Sure.
Because Molly's amazing. But she presented an opportunity for me that really started the ball rolling. And she was a huge mentor for me, and in terms of web standards, but just in terms of my overall career. And she opened up a lot of doors for me, which I am forever appreciative of. And through that, I got interested in doing more web standards work, and some of the work that we were doing ended up getting the advertising agency I was working for at the time up for an award at South by Southwest for web standards usage, for CSS usage. So I went to South by in 2005, which was weird for me because I'd gone there in the late 90s and 2000s for music. Well, I mean, the music part of South by Southwest started all the way back in 1987. I think. It was a long time ago. It may have even been before that. I think it was somewhere in the 80s. But so I had gone from like 1996 or 1997 through 2000 for music and film. And when I went and checked out the Interactive conference I think it was in 2000, and it was literally like the corner of the trade show floor. There was a guy selling a content management system that he made in FileMaker. There wasn't really a whole lot. There were maybe like a couple of panels and stuff, but even like so it was weird going back in 2005 and going only for Interactive and not going for music and film. But by then it had grown quite a bit. I mean, we had, in terms of the actual conference programming for Interactive, we maybe had 6 rooms in the convention center. And you could meet everybody who was at the thing. Like we would all be sitting on the floor in the hallways in between sessions.
It felt like one
talking.
thing.
Right. And that was where I met Eric for the first time. That was where I met Jeffrey for the first time. I met Jeff Veen. I met all of these different people. I had at that point gotten to work with Jen Robbins on Web Design in a Nutshell. I did some contributions to that. And so through that, met her and met Jeff Veen and met Tantek Celik and all of these other people who I knew from following all their blogs, but now I actually got to know them. And that's actually, at that South by Southwest is where I established a strong friendship with Jeremy Keith and Andy Budd and Richard Rutter, who then went on to form Clearleft. And all. It was kind of neat to see all of that stuff kind of form out of there. But that was kind of my path. And then in 2006, I was invited to join the Web Standards Project, which was amazing. And then a couple of years later, Glenda Simms, Derek Featherstone, and I became the leadership of the Web Standards Project, which was also kind of amazing. So that was kind of like my journey into the web standards world.
One step at a time. So,
I mean, I basically decided, I set my sights on what it was that I wanted to do, and whenever there was an opportunity to help somebody out that might create some visibility or something like that to enable me to meet people, I would try and take advantage of that. And obviously, not in kind of a self-serving sort of way, but trying to actually provide value and do what I could to help.
I can add this bit here.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, my whole relationship with A List Apart started when I asked Jeffrey if he needed copy editing help, because I mean I had been an editor for a magazine before coming to the web, and I was like, I can certainly copy edit, like that'd be fine. And then he realized that I would also be valuable from a technical editing skill, and so that's how I became one of the tech editors for A List Apart for a number of years. So it's just, you see ways that you can help out, and then you join in that.
Yeah, so take the chances when they prepared and take the chances when
exactly
when they appear.
Yep.
Yeah. Is there anyone who should get more involved in web standards who isn't right now? Or, I mean, some type of person.
I think we always need more people to be involved. I think we always need new ideas, and the W3C has some invited experts, but traditionally hasn't had that many invited experts to the CSS working group. At their meetings, they've always made it open so that if you wanted to come in and talk, like I was at the TPAC in Boston in 2007, 2006, something like that, in Cambridge. And I was able to sit in for 2 days on the CSS working group meetings. And I mainly just listened. So I kind of sat on the side and listened to what was going on. And then very nicely at the end, kind of towards the end of the second day, they just kind of turned around and said, you've been sitting here for 2 days listening to all this. What would you like to see? What are you interested in? And which I think is a really important thing for a standards body to do, because
Definitely.
In a lot of cases, the browsers are driving things so much as to what they want, what's going to scratch their itches. Because in a lot of cases they develop software as well, right?
Exactly.
So they're very much scratching their own itches. But and then there's the flip side of these would be interesting things to do from a academic standpoint. Yeah. But I think hearing what actual designers and developers want to do. So the two things that I threw out to them was I really want to be able to do rotation, which we hadn't been able to do at that point. Which had apparently been brought up multiple times on the working group list, but had never come to fruition. And then the other thing I said is I want to be able to do polygonal margins. I want to be able to basically do what I can do in InDesign or in Pagemaker or Quark. And actually be able to have it in a regular, follow the shape of an image, which now we have a CSS shape. So, there are two things that have come about. I don't think I had anything to do with them coming about, but, it certainly helps to have people saying, this is what we want. This is what we need to take web design to the next step. And so I think, certainly blogs are a way of talking about that. Conferences are a way of talking about that. Participating in the mailing lists are a good way of doing that. Even writing up silly ideas around how to do things. I actually put together 2 little PDFs as to what I wanted and what I thought the syntax could look like, right? Things are going to get interesting in the future for participation of folks who are more the workaday practitioners, the people who are in the trenches building websites every day. There's in the W3C, there's the Web Incubator Community Group, or it might be the Web Platform Incubator Community Group. But basically, the idea of that is to create a play zone, basically, and some tools to help people to come in with an idea that, maybe they have no idea what the implications are from an implementation standpoint, but to come in and try and convince other people that this might be an interesting idea, or at least worthy of exploration, and then they can work with people who work at the different browser manufacturers to potentially build a polyfill that would make that, or a prolyfill maybe, that of what the thing might become, to draft spec ideas, kind of along the lines of what the responsive images, now responsive issues community group did, where there's a use case, right? And we very much focused on here are the different use cases for responsive images, and then we worked to try and figure out what sort of markup patterns could support that, and then worked with the browser makers and people who'd been involved with specs in the past to help us figure out what are we missing, what don't we know, since we aren't really a part of this process. We're just the people who want the solution.
So that's something to look for then.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's an area that more people will be able to get involved with and should get involved with, because who knows? You may have the great idea for the next great CSS feature that we don't have.
Yeah, or someone could tell me that this is a bad idea because this, and then I can come back and
either refine it or. at least have a conversation around why it's a good idea or a bad idea, or why it might, where it might be more useful, or that sort of stuff. Because CSS, for instance, has implications beyond just HTML, because you can use it to style SVG or any XML documents and stuff like that. So, while there may not be applicability in certain areas, there may be in others, and maybe we can help to make other specs better. Maybe like one of the things that, like, a spec that I had a lot of hope for that I'm kind of dubious about right now is like the network profiling spec that allows you to know whether you're on a metered connection or a non-metered connection. So basically, like Wi-Fi versus your cell phone data plan, right?
And paid Wi-Fi versus other.
Right, and so I don't know. It doesn't seem there doesn't seem to be a marker to let it know whether you're on like a paid Wi-Fi network that I'm aware of yet.
No, me neither.
And the other piece of it is, let's say you're on your phone, but you're tethering your phone to your laptop. Your phone is on a pay per bit connection, and your computer only sees it as Wi-Fi. So, I think we need to kind of go beyond just the browser knowing from the device, but there may need to be something about how the network traffic is routed to indicate that a particular router is delivering something that's a metered connection. And
so that's a spec right now.
Well, yeah, there's a spec that just is the metered non-metered thing, but it's not like it doesn't. From my last reading of it, which granted it's been probably a year and a half, easily 2 years possibly since I last looked at it, but it didn't support kind of that extension of things, and maybe that's an area that we need to explore more. And maybe it's already exploring that. I haven't looked at it for a while because it didn't serve that need. So it seemed like a good idea. But the utility when the rubber met the road for me, and in terms of what I was working on at the time, wasn't as great as what I could see it being. So maybe that's an area that somebody has some interesting ideas. I know nothing about networking, so once you get into that area, I'm like, I don't know what you could or can't send on over the network.
So that's a spec sort of in progress. I'm not sure I'm using the right terminology, but
I believe that I'm trying to remember what the exact name of the spec is. It's basically like it might be the network profile API or something like that.
We can check it out.
Yeah, but
put a link in the show notes.
Yeah, I'll find it for you.
Great. Now, I was just wondering about a spec like that. If there isn't yet technical support below it, sort of, would it still be able to like go through the whole process and sort of be released as a standard?
So the way that the standards process works is that you have typically a working group working on the spec and kind of evolving it, but in order for it to become a technical recommendation, it has to go through being a working draft for a while, and then it moves to being like a candidate recommendation, and there's like feedback processes throughout, but it becomes a candidate recommendation, and then it requires two interoperable implementations that are independent interoperable implementations. So, for our purposes, either it would need to be in WebKit, it would need to be in Blink, it would need to be in the Edge HTML rendering engine, or it would need to be in the Mozilla rendering engine.
So there could never be sort of a forward-looking recommendation.
Yeah, it can never make it to the technical recommendation.
But it can be floating around as a point of discussion.
And sometimes people will do implementations based on even a working draft. Sometimes those will appear, because like Apple, for instance, they dropped linear gradients into the W3C after they had already implemented their first run version, but that spec got iterated on at the W3C to become the final version of the syntax, which they then also implemented behind the vendor prefix. you can have people do early implementations, but that's why we have vendor prefixes or feature flags and that sort of stuff in order to indicate that this is experimental, potential to change.
Yeah.
I don't know that many developers who just read somebody's blog post or go to Stack Overflow and like to get a question answered if they really understand that vendor prefixes mean experimental.
I think in a way, but I think they're so seductive sometimes.
Well, I mean, I agree. You're like, oh, it works, and you move on because we've all got other things to do, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this solves the problem nicely in this browser, so it'll stay there.
But then the browsers get rid of it, or in the case of like the gradients, the old syntax went away. Yeah. But now, kind of, because we used the old syntax only in some cases. Yeah. Other browsers are having to support that, and like Safari continues to support the old syntax because people were only using the old syntax and they would break the web. Yeah. I mean, you've got the Microsoft Edge browser, which and IE Mobile, which in the precursor to Windows 10, which actually implemented some of the WebKit prefix properties because the web just didn't work on their devices without that. I think, and Firefox did the same thing in Firefox Mobile.
Yeah. I think my feeling as a developer is that most developers are aware of what the prefix means. It's just that it tends to work too well, sort of, which is the good kind of problem in a way, but on another, it's so easy to get stuck there.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's kind of on the folks who respond to answer people's questions on Stack Overflow or who write about emerging technologies to really caution folks that, hey, the syntax may change, but also when a spec has reached maturity. It's reached maturity. It hasn't maybe been finalized, or it's not got every interoperable implementation, but that you do the standards version without the prefix as well, so that you're future-proofing what it is that you're building, which also doesn't happen a lot of times.
Maybe they should just break their prefix things more often, so people sort of
that's why browsers have experimented with feature flags. Alex Russell a little bit ago wrote up kind of a treatise on why feature flags might not be the way to go. That you could have. He floated a couple of different ideas, like allowing companies to participate in a public experiment where essentially the feature was turned on for their site for a specific amount of time, and then it would be turned off again. Which is, he floated some really interesting ideas, which I don't know what the right solution is ultimately going to be, and it's probably going to depend on the situation. Sure. And the particular thing that you're dealing with, whether it's a JavaScript API or whether it's a CSS property or something like that. But vendor prefixes have kind of bitten us in the ass. And so, we need to. There's got to be a better way than that. Yeah,
and it's good that it's being thought about.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's certainly being thought about at Google. It's being thought about at Microsoft. I can only imagine it's being thought about at Mozilla.
Yeah, I mean, every single browser wants to get out from under it, I guess. Yeah. So, are there any common misconceptions about the standards work?
I don't know about necessarily misconceptions about standards. I think a lot of people have the perspective that the standards work moves really slowly. And, it's really interesting given that we have like the what we G, and then we've got the W3C, and the what we G is like, okay, we're not going to version HTML anymore. And, the W3C is kind of like creating versions of specs and stuff. But I mean, the way I kind of look at it is languages evolve, right?
Sure.
Even like English as a language evolves. We add new words, words fall out of favor, all that sort of stuff. I'm sure it's the same thing in Swedish and every other language, right? And to me, when a dictionary is kind of it's a point in time that's a reference to what the language was like at that time in that place. With some politics in there, too, in terms of which new words made it in, which ones didn't. So I kind of see like the HTML spec, the CSS specs, and such being snapshots in time of the evolution of HTML or of the evolution of CSS. And I like the modularity of CSS. I think that's going to allow that spec to as a whole, the language as a whole, to evolve more quickly. I kind of wish that the HTML5 spec was modularized in a similar way, because to me, there's like HTML5, the markup language, and then there's like HTML5, all of the APIs for JavaScript and stuff, which are all kind of lumped together. And to me, as you know, somebody who's come from the building the web, you know, not necessarily working for a browser maker, even though you know, now I work for Microsoft, and I'm not doing client work so much. But to me, like the HTML spec, like somebody would be like, "Can you build us an HTML5 set?" I'm like,
nope.
Well, what do you want to talk about? Like what's HTML5 mean to you?
Exactly.
Because there's a lot of different interpretations of that. You know, are you using HTML5 based elements, or are you using APIs? Which APIs are you using? You know, certain HTML, quote unquote HTML5 APIs, like the WebDB or WebSQL rather, that disappeared because you know the Microsoft and Mozilla were not fans, and so we got IndexedDB, which is now the client-side database option. You know, it's interesting. I think I'm hopeful that maybe that'll become modularized in the future, and it'll be able to, you know, the markup language will be able to evolve on its own, and some of the APIs can evolve in their own specs, so that things can kind of speed up. You know, I think if there is a misconception around standards, I think that that there's a misconception maybe that we don't need them, that they're holding us back. I mean, I know I run into that a lot working in kind of the progressive enhancement space. There's been a lot of pushback, especially from people in the JavaScript world who don't want to have to support older devices or different OSs and things like that. And I don't necessarily blame people for having that perception, but I think that it's all about what your experience is and what you've seen. My first experience of the web was via the command line, and I was using I'm fairly certain I was using Gopher to access the web. And all I saw when I went to visit Sony.com was literally the words image, 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 image. And I was like, this web thing is bullshit. But I think because that was my first experience of the web, it made me understand that not everybody has the same experience of the web, because that site was obviously designed for somebody who had a visual browser. And when my school eventually got a PPP connection, point-to-point protocol connection, I was able to use, I think Netscape was probably the first visual browser I used. And then I was able to see Sony just fine. Yeah. Of course, all the text was locked up in images, as you know, that was kind of the way that we did things way back then, because we didn't have web fonts and people weren't happy with the type of fonts that were available, the font choices that were available online. But so I think a lot of people who've been newer to the web, who you know have come to the web in the last 10 years or even the last 15 years, have a much more narrow view of what the web is, and how people experience it. So I try to work to broaden people's perspective on that, and to help them understand that, you know, there are people who access the web without a mouse. There are people who access the web without being able to see what you've put on the page, without being able to understand the hierarchy and the relationships that you've established, because they don't, you know, they're not sighted or heavier, that have problems interacting with what you've created because they're a power user and they want to use their keyboard only and they don't really use their mouse. Or that there are people who, you know, maybe on a quote-unquote smartphone, but that smartphone may be a $35 Firefox phone because they're in India and all they have is $35 to spend on a phone. They don't have $799 to buy the latest Samsung device or what have you.
This seems like a touch device, but it's a Windows 10 desktop with a touch screen.
Right. I mean, there's so many different ways of accessing the web, and that's the beauty of the web to me. I mean, that's its power, is that it can go anywhere and be used by anybody. But when you only have one sort of experience, like I feel like one of the things that's holding us back as an industry is that we are mostly Mac users, we are mostly Chrome users, and we don't experience the web the way that everybody else does, right? So I think the more that we get out there and understand that there's a lot of variability. I mean, even just as simple as like different monitors displaying colors differently. I mean, that's a really simple thing, but not every monitor is calibrated the same.
No, or a projector for that matter. When you go to show it to someone,
right? Exactly, and viewing, even the exact same device in like outdoors versus indoors, like color contrast matters. That and we get focused on. If somebody has a mouse, I can make hit targets smaller. Well, sometimes stuff happens, and like you may have broken your dominant arm, and you're trying to use a mouse with your other arm, and you're like crap at it, right?
Yeah, it's almost an accessibility thing.
It is absolutely an accessibility thing.
Easier for everyone.
Exactly. So, I mean, I think that we as an industry need to start embracing the variability of experience. And creating opportunities for people to access content however they need to access it. And that's really going to empower our stuff to go further. I mean, if you think about it, think about video games today, and then you go back in time and you look at video games like Zork, right? That was purely text-based command line stuff. That may seem like ancient history from a video game perspective, but in a lot of ways, that's the future of interaction design for us, because we're heading towards this world of voice-based interactions with the web and with our software and stuff like that. So how do you design for a completely non-visual UI? Right? You have to think really hard about what the content is that you're writing, how you're describing that content in order to make it accessible to somebody purely via speech. So screen readers are really pointing the way to how that interaction is going to go. So the more that we think about that stuff now, the more we're going to empower our sites that we're building and the applications that we're building to be able to be used in that future. Because not every piece of software is a photo editor. No, right?
Most aren't. Actually,
exactly. So if you're writing a Slack type app for instance, having it so that could be done purely via voice would be insanely useful.
Yeah, and why wouldn't it?
Exactly.
Most of it is text.
Exactly. And I think the more that we can kind of view experience as a continuum, the more power we give to our stuff, and the more value we create with the things that we're building. And honestly, the more money we have to potentially be able to make, because we can reach more people.
It just struck me now that we were talking that. I was reminded of this, differences in the browsers we use and stuff like that when I started trying content blockers for latest Mac OS and the phone. And suddenly some sites don't load, I can't log in.
Right.
And also, when we're talking about enhancement and making money, you block lots of ads. Ad companies are really worried. If they had used like progressive enhancement for their ads, they wouldn't have a problem.
Right, exactly.
Which is kind of... I can't believe I want them to make their ads more accessible.
Well, I mean, I think it's definitely a challenge, and I think a lot of that has come from just agreed on the part of the advertisers for like, I can get access to more data. I want as much data as possible, and so it's the privacy has become a big pusher for a lot of that stuff. And so, that's why we have the content blockers. But at the same time, because those ads want so much information, they've become so bulky, and just that slowed down the overall web experience. It's not just a privacy thing, it's a performance thing. Same thing with web fonts. Web fonts can be great, but they can really bog down. I mean, anytime I try and go to Wired on my phone, even if I'm at home and my wireless is really fast and my internet connection at home is 1 meg up, or 100 megs up and down. So I've got a really fast internet connection, yet Wired on my phone will take sometimes 6 or 7 seconds just to load an article. And I'm just sitting there waiting for it to get the web fonts, which is, that's the problem. It'll load the rest of the text or the rest of the page, but it'll just be white, no text.
No one wants that flash of unstyled content,
which I'm fine with. I would rather be able to start reading your article, but I remember when I started using Ghostery and Crumble and some of the other content blockers that are available for Chrome. Some sites just wouldn't load at all, and that was because they were actually requiring that the ads be loaded before they loaded any content, and it was just bizarre to me. Really strange stuff.
It took me so long to realize as well when sites were loading like blank with like blue lines here and there. I said, it's the fonts not loading.
I can't remember. I don't remember which site it was, but there was one, and I tweeted about this a couple months ago. It was either like The Economist or one of those sorts of magazines that I went to the site, and literally the site would not load without ads. And if you think about it, I guess I question whether it was an intentional decision or whether it was an inadvertent one. So, because if it was intentional, then it seems like their judgment call is that serving an ad is more important than delivering content. I would like to believe that it was something that they didn't intend to happen, and so that would be something that they would fix, as opposed to like actually enforcing that in the long term. But
I would hope. Yes, you also mentioned when we were discussing by email subjects, you also mentioned performance. So I was just curious, like in which way? Web performance in general, or
in a lot of cases download performance. I mean, I think that's certainly.
That's also one of those things that's really easy to start. Like, no, it's not that bad. Most of our people are wired most of the time. Surely.
It's easy to make that assumption, and it's not the case. Even something as simple as just the tunnel effect of being on a train and being on your phone, and then all of a sudden losing network connectivity, or hotel Wi-Fi, or conference center Wi-Fi, or whatever. There's all sorts of. I mean, even the Wi-Fi here, I get kicked off every now and then because there's too many connections, and so it drops out. And being that I'm only in Sweden for a couple of days, I didn't do an international data plan, so I don't have anything to fall back to. So, if I think our focus always needs to be on delivering a baseline experience that somebody can do what they need to do, and then we can bring in those enhancements after the fact. I mean, I think, a good example of that is, a landing page for a magazine or a newspaper. On a large screen, thumbnails are really helpful because they draw your eye to the most important articles on the page, right?
Sure.
But on a small screen, you don't have that competition for space. So don't load in the thumbnails on those smaller screens, at all. And don't just display none the image, because in most cases they'll still be downloaded. Tim Kadlec has some great research into when images are downloaded and when they're not. But find a way to bring in the images only when it makes sense to do so. And just be always focusing on what is the core what is the core message of this page, what is the core task that the user needs to be able to accomplish, how many dependencies do I have that could be not met and cause them not to be able to do that.
And don't load the stuff until you know you need it.
Exactly. And so reducing the number of dependencies that you have. I mean, I think a kind of a classic example that really illustrates this is you're creating a button to submit a form, right? You could use an input of type submit or a button of type submit. Either of those would work. Mm-hmm. You could use an anchor. We've seen those certainly a lot. Yep. And we could use a div.
Yep.
So with the input or button, we get the look and feel of a button by default in the browser. So we don't necessarily need CSS for that. It will still look like an interactive element. Mm-hmm. It will receive focus using a keyboard. So it's an interactive element.
Yep.
It is clickable using a mouse, using the keyboard, either with I think it's enter key or spacebar would activate the control. And they're both capable of submitting the form.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, with the link, it can receive focus, because it's a link, it's an interactive element, but it requires CSS to look like a button. And if there's an interruption in your CSS being downloaded, then it may not end up looking like a button. It requires JavaScript to submit the form. It requires JavaScript to enable it to be activated with the enter key. The spacebar will activate a link, but the enter key won't. So you've added 4 dependencies basically to make that happen. Now the div, you have all of the dependencies that the anchor has, but you also have to make it capable of receiving focus, which means you need to add a tab index to it, and you need to make it activatable using the spacebar. So, you're just increasing the number of dependencies and the number of potential things that could go wrong that could cause your interface to fail to work. And dependencies in general are not a good thing. You don't want to have too many of them.
Yeah, sure.
It's all about building something that's more robust. And so, I think, and that's just a button, like we're talking about. It's a really simple thing. And yet it's, so as you get into the more and more complicated interfaces, there are ways to accomplish what it is that you need to do. And, the way that I kind of, I benefit from having been on the web for as long as I have. But, I looked to how we did things in Web 1.0, when all we had was HTTP and HTML, basically, right? How did we accomplish these things? We had most of the same types of sites that we have now. Yeah, maybe we didn't have web-based photo editors and web-based code editors and stuff like that, but not, the vast majority of stuff that we build for the web is not code editors, not online photo and video editing suites and stuff like that. That's a very specialized subset of things. But you could completely build Basecamp. You could completely build Harvest. All of these different applications, web applications, could completely be built using Web 1.0 technologies. Maybe you wouldn't be able to have a JavaScript-based timer on the web page, but you could probably accomplish the same thing with a frame, even an iframe with a meta refreshing page in it. If you really wanted to have that, right? There are ways to accomplish these things. And so, I like to look at that and okay, so that can be my baseline experience. And then now how do I make it better? How do I make this a snappier experience for somebody? How do I, remove the friction from their experience? How do I design something that's better? But at least I always know that I've got that fallback that if something goes wrong, if one of these dependencies isn't met, I'm still left with something that's usable.
Yeah. Makes me interested now to think about more. We could make our web application more progressive, sort of.
Yeah. Well, shameless plug. My the second edition of Adaptive Web Design will be out in December, so that goes through a lot of this stuff.
And also 2 sessions tomorrow, right?
Yeah, 2 sessions tomorrow here. One on forms, and then one on basically dispelling excuses for not doing progressive enhancements. So,
and they will all be out on the web as well.
Hopefully, yes.
Progressive or not, who knows? Thank you so much. This was really interesting.
Thanks a lot, Fredrik. Yeah.
Let me put it this way, Mr. Raymer. The 9000 series is the most reliable computer ever made. No 9000 computer has ever made a mistake or distorted information. We are all, by any practical definition of the words, foolproof and incapable of error.